Hi, good morning and welcome everyone to the CASI seminar series. I'm Sharath Pillai, one of the coordinators of the seminar. The other coordinators are Tariq Tachal and Amrita Kurian. Before I begin talking about today, I just want to do a quick plug-in for our next seminar, which will be held on November 30th, and that is a fully in-person event. And we will have Joel Lee of Williams College speaking at that seminar. And today we are extremely delighted to virtually host Shruti Kapila. And this talk is co-sponsored by South Asia Center and the Departments of History and South Asian Studies. Shruti Kapila is a professor of history and politics at the University of Cambridge. She's a fellow and director of studies at Corpus Christi College and co-director of the Global Humanities Initiative at Cambridge. She works on modern and contemporary India and global political thought. She is one of the leading figures among a new generation of historians who revive the study of ideas in Indian history, or what we might broadly call as Indian intellectual history, and especially in situating intellectual history as a study of ideas propounded by Indian leaders and politicians, rather than seeing intellectual history as a study of the colonial state or just colonial officials, as was previously done. Her recent book, Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought and Global Age, Princeton 2021, which many of you will have read, made a bold intervention in how we understand the Indian political thought in late colonial India. She traces the history of fraternity, or the problem of living together with others, and how central was this problem to the thought of Indian leaders, to Indian political thought in general. And she also shows the entanglements of fraternity with conceptions of sovereignty and violence. So here again, rather than situating the political in the state or the capacity for violence in the state alone, she advances a subject-oriented understanding of the political in this book. So here again, she kind of moves away from a statist understanding of political thought and political in general. So she's a well-known public intellectual in India and the UK. She writes very regularly for many leading publications, including Financial Times, Prospect Magazine, Al Jazeera, and many of you will be familiar with her regular column for The Print. And she's also training to be a psychoanalyst. That's, I think, really cool. Today, she is going to share with us some of her new work on democracy, and her talk is entitled Walking for Democracy, A History in 3 Moments. So Shruti will speak for about 35 minutes, after which there will be Q&A. If you want to ask questions, the best way is to type it in the chat box, or you digitally raise your hand. I will call on you to ask the question. So over to you, Shruti.
Well, thank you. It's a total delight and pleasure to be in conversation here. Thank you so much, Sharath, and also Tariq. It's great to actually meet Tariq like this, and also Sharath, to see you after the last time we were in Teen Murti. So if anyone wants to find me in person, I'll be in Teen Murti next month. But that's and thank you also for a very generous and actually quite accurate summary of my previous work. And I should say that I'm sort of opening this comment with also with a bit of trepidation, because this is an absolutely new piece of work that I've embarked on. There'll be some continuity with the earlier work, particularly on Gandhi, but I have just signed a major book contract, I can put it like that, for a book on Indian democracy. And that book will actually not trace it from as it is from Nehru to now, but it's a book really starting with the return of Indira Gandhi in 1980 to the present moment. So in some ways, it's a work of contemporary history. And this is, in a way, a kind of backdrop to that work. It's not really a chapter of the book, but it's a kind of backdrop to that work. I've also, for the last 8 years, been teaching an upper level course in Indian democracy at Cambridge. And so it's, in a way, in some ways, both new and somewhat old, this work for me. And what I'm trying to do really here is to kind of as you said, I was interested, you pointed out to this idea that I was going to signal here, that I'm really interested in a subject-oriented idea of politics. Like it's particularly trying not so much to kind of obfuscate the state, but to, in a way, decenter the state. And or why and how, whether that will be the conclusion of the paper, whether the state and the political will become one thing in India, and is that what we are seeing? So my previous book really was really about arguing that the Indian political was founded beyond the state, and it was also something in a way that the state never became the destination of politics. This was not an anarchist politics, but it was a politics which did not, unlike the West, see the state as the preeminent author or destination of politics. And for me, the political really has always meant power, conflict, and antagonism, rather than simply the representation and management of interests or groups, which is not to deny their what's the word there? I can't seem to move the slide. So let me sort of say that I'm going to very briefly not talk too much about historiography or any of that, but we are all aware that there are kind of 3 or 4 dominant approaches to Indian democracy. One being political economy, the second, the everyday state, the third on the relations between patron and clients, and fourth, constitutionalism and the work of the Indian Constitution in, as it were, developing a democratic ethos in India. At the same time, there's been a robust debate, particularly amongst historians, as to where and when the origins of Indian democracy may have, where did it come from? Where did it start? And I'm not talking about the mythic histories that people may attach to them in terms of ancient India or even the village republic, but I'm really speaking very much in the context of the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century. And here there are 2, as it were, I would say, starkly, I'm going to be, since I've only got 30 minutes, I'm going to be fairly crass. And I'm going to also talk about very quickly where my position is. I'll kind of play my cards out very, very openly. Is really there are two kind of positions people take. One, which is the Government of India Act of 1935. In fact, one of the reviews, which was critical of my book, pointed out that I did not take, the foundation of the people, as it were, the democratic people, that was first actually founded in this act. And I remain convinced that that is not the real story, and that actually the real story lies not simply in a wider Gandhian movement, which Sumit Sarkar writes about, but really I would place Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha as the founding moment of Indian democracy, and which laid down a very consistent vocabulary and grammar for democratic practice. So what I'm trying to do with this book, in the earlier book, what I had done was really to take India's leading actors, political actors, and converted them with the kind of, as thinkers. Here I'm doing something slightly different, though I retain an interest in conceptual languages. My main interest is in political history. It will be a historical take rather than one which is about systemic approaches, whether they are to political economy or the state. But which is to say, the contingency will be built into this story, while I also look very carefully at the changing political vocabularies that gained ascendancy in this period. Particularly when I mean the work political history, I'm especially interested in the work of the event as theorized, particularly by, I'm going to be very telegraphic, as theorized by current sort of French philosophical thinking. I'm especially thinking about Alain Badiou, that actually the event is something that is discovered, made, again, beyond the limits of the state, because the state is primarily interested in regulation and policing, as well as creating, as it were, the norms, or given norms of political engagement. But it's really that prizes apart the political is discovered through a break with, as it were, with the normal, as it were, everyday unfolding of the state or even its practices that constitutes, in my view, a true event in Indian politics. And I will, in my view, there are while very eventful, the history of Indian democracy, particularly after 1950, is especially eventful. In this very strict sense, there are not that many meta events that take place which cause a significant rupture from which there is no return. They may have a historical antecedent, but things can never go back to usual, i.e. what are the kind of norm-changing events of India's politics. And here I am going to take a very broad sweep, and this will be an argument, and people can argue with me whether the emergency is such an event as well, but I will argue the Indian emergency is not. But there are two major events that I take as a kind of game-changing and paradigmatic in terms of laying norms. One is, of course, Salt Satyagraha. Both entail walking and the idea of the yatra. And the second is L.K. Advani's Rath Yatra in 1990. And I will be focusing mostly on those two, and they will be kind of diametrically they will speak to some kind of common themes, but they're also very different kinds of mobilizations. Also, I want to say very quickly that, I also want to eschew, again, provocation here, eschew the language of mobilization and movement, because those presume a collective agency that can then be kind of historicized or socially or politically accounted for. I'm interested in precisely how new collectivities and new fraternities or new associations come to being in that very act of the event, which can then later be historicized and folded into other political narratives, whether or sometimes even obscured. So let me start very quickly. Some of you may know this from my work on Gandhi in the book. But in the book, I kind of spend a little bit time on Gandhi's kind of subject-oriented politics, and why Gandhi sort of intervened in a way through Indian vocabularies of yatra or pilgrimage, and also in a way very quickly, again telegraphically, that this is not about civil disobedience, whereas what Gandhi really does is uses everyday human practices and capacities of self-making and self-transition to create new and enduring political languages and grammars, and a grammar that then becomes foundational for Indian democracy. So so in part, this is because, as Sarath mentioned, I'm interested in the question of the subject, or who is the agent, as opposed to, just mobilization or even a given collective. In short, unlike mobilization is an effect or a consequence, but is not the engendering political subject or the agent of democracy. So, which is not to say mobilizations don't count, but they do not have that agentive work that can be sort of seen with it. So Gandhi, in a way, with 1931, really has laid this down, and everyone would know this history. But for what Gandhi's politics, as anyone would know, the event forms is an important in the sense it has a very precise, every major political act for Gandhi had a very precise beginning, middle, and an end. It was very structured like an event. Secondly, Gandhi's public enactments and mass mobilizations, to use that word, were very few and far between, one every decade. He had smaller ones, or otherwise he mostly spent time in retreat. 31 is a game changer precisely because it calls for, it's an all or nothing movement. It's an act of will in which each individual is summoned only to go down for a walk. I mean, much like Advani later, he did not expect this to be a success. He started off from his ashram with 50 people. By the time he ended the Salt Satyagraha, something like 250,000 people had walked with him. And there is amazing now footage. It's also one of the earlier moments of political photography and as it were, live filming, recorded filming of political events, because he's actually followed by Pathé cameramen throughout, which kind of, but what he did really was to, through a kind of the act of the individual, he wanted to make a new subjectivity visible, or rather, which is to say, he wanted to create new political conditions. So the event was tied, as we know it was called Satyagraha, was tied to the idea of truth, which does not mean simply that we should speak the truth or it's a moral value, but really the truth for Gandhi was the interruption of the abstract and replacing that the abstraction of politics with something which is experienced, immediate, and internalized. And at the same time, it is highly given to a highly visual vocabulary. So the act of walking for Gandhi then, became that event, this 10-day event, which in a way was interested in, the abstract nature of political economy, of poverty. Primarily, this was a critique of empire's economic policies because of salt being heavily not only monopolized, but heavily taxed. And where Gandhi had said, repeatedly, he had kind of critiqued economic and nationalists for using the abstract and juridical language of statistics to make who had been mounting a case against the empire on the economic critique of empire for 30 years prior to, in fact, Gandhi's major movement. But really, he in his own writings throughout on salt, he said that the statistics cannot just simply lie, but they can also give a truth effect. Effect is my word, but they can even give a form of truth to something which is either hidden or is in fact or a lie. So for Gandhi, truth, like evil, was actually something which had a hidden quality to it, precisely because it is consensual, it is hidden, we just all accept it as a form of a norm. And what he wanted to do was to break it apart through this very kind of, almost kind of staging of a theatrical exercise in which, you go break the salt with poor people right at the shorelines. Today, it maybe looks kind of very, we may be tired of these acts, but this at that time seemed incredibly radical. But what it also did through this interruption was that it laid bare, as it were, the kind of objective nature of the empire and its kind of economic policies. But at the same time, it produced, as I said, an immediate and experiential quality to the abstract nature of politics. So politics is not something which is a spectacle to be imbibed or to be even viewed, which might change in today's time, but it is something which then kind of becomes both internal and experiential. In 1915, when he first came back from India, he chastised Gokhale, his mentor, for Gokhale, the last great liberal of India, was not a walker. And they had these huge arguments that, because Gokhale was unable, and Gandhi chastised him for not just becoming unhealthy, but actually criticized his mentor for producing a kind of political mobilization which was dependent on trains and on railways. And he kept saying that I'm tired of you taking me in carriages. What I really want to do is produce a politics of self-denial. These are his words, and disciplinary resolutions, which can then be enacted by those who feel fully committed to it. So it was a point of kind of like defeat with Gokhale that he had not managed to get Gokhale to walk. So if they have this massive contretemps at one level, and where they are in a very major tirth or pilgrimage site, and Gandhi refuses to take the train to walk with him, and he says, I'm really fed up of traveling by train and car. We have the sun and the sky and the earth above and below. It's no matter. It's no small matter to come into contact with villagers. It is a pilgrimage. And the universe is a reflection of ourselves, and as such, for him, this becomes instructive, and they're in the Tirtha, and he says, well, this is a very polluted site precisely because people are feasting, people are doing all the, and what we really need is a spirit of self-abnegation, discipline, to create a kind of, to create, as it were, a new association. So the focus, of course, for him, was again not just beyond the kind of the state, but it was also like for him the act of walking was in a way also kind of traversing and breaking apart of other ways of kind of collectivizing public opinion and mobilizing public opinion. And it's not simply in terms of violence and non-violence, but it also allowed him to, these are the provocations, to kind of think the political as not simply as something which belonged to the state, or even simply that which was about the social. It was something which had at a pure potentiality, which could be activated by acts of individual will. And so, and what it really does is the consequentialist argument here is that precisely because it is a success, it also creates the distinction, a very visible distinction, to what Richard Tuck would call the distinction between popular sovereignty and government, that you really get, as it were, the naming, the placing, and the visualizing of the people. But also Gandhi, in a way, eschewed part of his critique of Gokhale is also this distinction between leaders and masses that he wanted to break apart. People speaking on the podium and on the dais, and repeatedly his political vocabulary, because walking is also seen to be palliative and therapeutic, as everyone knows from how it has come back in a big way in the pandemic. He always used the language of the patient and the Vaidya. For him, the relationship between politics was one of a doctor and a patient, in which we were both our doctors, our Vaidyas, as well as that we were all sick to a degree. For him, walking was an ekiesis, a form of moral labor, and there are other ways in which he kind of deploys this metaphor. I don't have time to say it, but he would say that there is a kind of cruelty in this act of walking, because yes, it demands a certain fitness, but at the same time, it's a kind of very basic all or nothing act, because what it's really asking people is to get up, move, and join him in it. It's not really like, as it were, witnessing or darshan of a major political leader or listening to speeches. One of the most profound elements of Gandhi's work on writing on walking, on which there are several bits throughout his long life, is that it is always occasioned with an excursus on silence. So Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha is incredibly silent. It is bereft of speeches that we will see, which would happen with so it's about silence, but he would also expend a great deal of thought on the idea of sleep and consciousness, which again, no time to talk about, but it's part of the same. It is part of the same matrix. So. But what he said regarding, as it were, his critiques of large public meetings and demonstrations, and particularly political speeches, was that, of course, they had their time and place. He concedes that to Gokhale, but he says, quote unquote, but cannot make a nation or a popular sovereignty. So Gandhi was correct to, in a way, identify but also one of the things he said was that the problem with the masses leaders was that these were not these produced new hierarchies, or they kind of conformed back to caste hierarchies and so on. So his conceit was that if you ended up walking with untouchables or into into those areas, these acts would even kind of transform or kill caste. And here I think Gandhi is not wrong, both in the potential of walking but as a form of pilgrimage, though he was himself opposed to the destination of pilgrimage, which is the Tirtha itself, but took walking as a form of a yatra or a journey. But for him, it had no, as it were, destination, but only an end point. So the act of walking was an end in itself. The yatra or a walk is, as we know from the work of religious historians of religion and anthropology, is that it's a journey or it's a crossing, and it's a crossing which is really in the Indian scriptures a crossing of death. It's really something which speaks, it's a movement, therefore it's a recursive movement, not simply between the divine and human, but between death and liberation of freedom itself, because the giving up, the abnegation, all of that it entails. But it also importantly is a temporary delinking of given social relations, because you move out of the house, out of your own, as it were, social fixities and familial relations. It is also a temporary renunciation of mundanity and given obligations and norms, and it imposes a hardship. This giving away of energy is a consequence of moral labor, but also physical labor, and it is tied in, of course, religious rendering, tied to a union or wanting to join up with the divine. And this is what the work on very excellent works on Indian pilgrimage tell us. But for Gandhi, this was actually about the joining up and as a kind of fraternal question and a bonding ritual. Walking was both highly individuated, but it was also a bonding ritual of association. It also offered temporary equality between people, and this, and it was also the dissolving and experiencing of the other in a way that was not possible in given Indian relations. So this dissolution of leaders and masses was part of the experiential nature of politics, but it also gave a sense of unity, and I'm being and an immediacy, but also a sense of scale because of the long scale of the walk that it took. So in some ways, it does have kind of spatial and national metaphors for but above all, it gathers and names the so-called mass or the popular that is the basis of democracy. And this is why this is a kind of moment of real summoning for Indian politics, because hitherto all the mobilizations had been done under the banner of the Congress, or you had these annual shows, and very much like ritualized rallies that are now the very expensive habits of Indian elections. And you've not, and so different from, as it were, from, in some ways, I also want to make a point that actually the act of walking is different from marches and demos or demonstrations that also partake analogously from the religious form, but really actually belong much more closer, and this is Freud has written about it. They take much more from rituals of the army, and particularly the Prussian army. And there's really excellent literature in the German cases on how, as it were, demonstrations come from, as it were, a militaristic ethos. So in a way, it's interesting that Gandhi chooses not to have demonstrations, not to have marches, but instead uses walking as a thing. So it's really, but it's not simply a matter of ritual, but it is a vitalist act of public and political sentiment, because the thing that interests me really is my work is really the psychic life of power and politics. So Gandhi is not so much about civil disobedience, so even though as he breaks apart the state, but of identifying popular sovereignty as beyond the government or the state, or indeed the given law. And his critique of mass meeting speeches is keeping with his critique of liberal democratic tactics and strategies. So that's kind of, and so therefore for him, it's this highly individuated, simple work, which is both spontaneous as well as but as well as discipline. In short, the major effect that Gandhi has on the political is to really, I use the word advisedly, or rather very technically, he spiritualizes the political. Spiritualizes means the act to be something other than oneself. And in that sense, Gandhi is really seeking that self-transformation as indexical of something bigger and greater, which is why the demand would always be to be highly disciplined in his, and he would call off movements where the discipline is broken. There's a critique to be had of Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha, where he actually openly disbars women to join them precisely because they would cause not simply the potentiality for indiscipline, but precisely because they could replicate the family form, which is what he also wants to break apart from in these mobilizations. He's wanting to break apart from the kind of familial static form that so it's not pilgrimage in the sense. So the second one, I just want to come in the next 5-7 minutes that I have. I mean, I want to say something about Advani's as a Yatra. Most of you would know it happens in 1990, and the real reason for me is that not only does it kind of partake of Gandhi's certain tactics, but it offers, in terms of India's contemporary politics, I want to give a genealogy and a form of continuity, though I'm really been interested in ruptures, a continuity to Modi's regime. We tend to think of Modi as a kind of someone who has innovated Hindutva, which he has, but we tend to kind of think of these two as separate episodes, or we don't tend to think of them as the same thing. For me, actually, an excavation of Advani's writings, and particularly the lead up to the Rath Yatra, shows that what we now call authoritarian populism, or populism itself and its relationship to Hindutva, is actually fully, the grammar of it is actually laid down in the moments, or in the fashioning of the Rath Yatra itself. So here we know that the temple is now fully is a legalized entity. It is for which this yatra is started, or that is the idea of it, in January 2024. And in a way, the state finally legalizes, one can say, the Hindu nationalist project. And there's a vast change in this period, which I can't go into, particularly or the relationship, the intermediate relationship between party politics and such mobilizations or walking acts. And so I see Modi very much in continuation of LK Advani. Advani himself, in his interview before he sort of retires from active political life, he is asked what is the meaning of his life, what has been the greatest, and he says his greatest achievement of his life has been to create a new debate on nationalism and secularism in particular, and he singles out the Rath Yatra as his key political act. And it is correct for him to admit that, because it really does lay down the foundations of new truths, just the way truth is important for Gandhi in overturning the imperial idea of economy. I think, it's safe to say that after Advani, we do have very new political truths that come to being. So the Rath Yatra, as you can see, the map started in. It's significant that it starts in Gujarat, in Somnath, which is also a temple, which is. It's not. I mean, I want to make a very clear point that this is not about the spiritualization of Hindu politics, but it's quite the opposite, because the Somnath temple is tied to the history of India's independence movement itself. It is tied to the founding of India's independent movement, and this is where the idea to kind of restore it is put on Nehru's burden, and that history apart, which is to say that that very important point to make, that if you look at the map, this is a map of party politics rather than a sacred geography of Hindu nationalism. It will go also through Nagpur, which is the capital of Rashtra Swayamsevak Sangh. Now, if Gandhi had kind of looked at the self and discipline as the key thing, there are major changes that the Rath Yatra brings. First, it adds a materiality to the act of psychic investment, particularly by introducing the idea of water that comes in from the Ganga, bottled water. This is 1990. Plastic bottles are not everywhere as they are today, but it introduces the idea of a shared fluid and it gives creates a kind of more institutionalized structure to the ethical demands that of Gandhi's walk. So there's an act of almost communion without you actually having to do the labor of walking. So in that sense, it's not quite a pilgrimage in the sense. Of course, the date initially chosen was the 31st of October, 1984, but that to start the foundation of the temple. But because of Indira Gandhi's assassination, that date itself had to be moved. And there's with him with Modi, and it like Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha. I have it from many reporters who worked on at that moment, that no one expected for this yatra to become Rath Yatra to become such a mass success and so immediately. And the context of it are given. There is, of course, the Shah Bano legal story in 85, but the big trigger actually that triggers the Rath Yatra is the 1987 riots in Meerut, which will also then lay down, if there is a kind of recursive movement between Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha and constitutional settlements, that he does a movement, there's a settlement, there's a kind of conversation on legal matters, on how to kind of share power. It's the opposite with Advani's Rath Yatra, that it kind of really strong sentiment of violence kind of becomes a form of mobilization, but follows it and precedes it. It not simply follows it, but violence had preceded the actual act of the thing. Secondly, just as the way you had water, bricks will soon replace water in Feb 1989. It takes a long time. It's a mistake to think that there is no planning done in this. This is if you look at the records, this has taken the better part of 6 years in planning and various meetings between various organizations. And here the two architects of the Rath Yatra, apart from Advani, Pramod Mahajan, the slain political leader, the first media mass communications leader of the modern variety in Indian electioneering. And the other is, of course, Narendra Modi, because the mobilization comes from Gujarat to begin with, and it becomes, this is his really calling card to moving up onto the ladder of a political office in the BJP. But the participation, what the BRICS do is that it gives participation without the actual act of walking, and it makes it a kind of a passive. It makes it into a kind of passive passive exercise, to which other things are added, like coupons are added, plus also donor stickers are added. So there's a way in which this becomes a kind of participatory, like a Ponzi scheme. Add to it, you get the idea of service with car sevaks as becoming the real foot soldiers of it. So of course, very quickly in 1989, you have the election, you have the coalition politics. I'll find the date coincidental, that the day of the start of the Rath Yatra is the same day as the Berlin Wall falls. So there's a kind of anti-communism echo here. But I want to say that the Rath Yatra makes a major, again, a consequentialist point, a success. It's a major success because it manages to focus attention and galvanizes and coheres emotions in what is actually a volatile and inchoate and highly contested political landscape. No one is able to hold any attention. And I just want to say a couple of things. The Librehans Commission makes a very interesting point. I'm coming to my end, sorry. Librehans Commission makes two very important points. The justice who writes the record of it, he says, well, it's not simply a cause and effect in terms of the masjid falling, but its main effect is not, as it were, to create a consensus for the temple. And this is so instructive, but it is in effect silencing of secularism. It's a silencing of criticism against the Ram Temple, against the politics, the new politics that is coming. So I think it's a fascinating set of points that he makes, because what Advani innovates here is that, unlike Gandhi, there's a very strong audiosonic landscape and noise to the Rath Yatra as it progresses, and there's a mobility of violence that is done. Importantly, the map, as I said, is not a sacred geography, but a new political geography of India, which we are still living with. But it's also a new political, it's not simply, I wanted to say that about Somnath, that Somnath is not simply about the freedom and the founding that would have to be unfounded, but it is also made into a language of injury and wounding. And this will allow two things to happen. One, that Advani will decide, like we see it with Trump, we see it with Modi, is a kind of denial of the media to actually carry any truth. So this is the first major onslaught on the Indian media to speak this truth. And secondly, he would cause a breach by using not so much the language of Hindu nationalism, but will give primacy to the word pseudo-secularism, which is to really make the point that there is something fake about India's legal compact. Above all, what again, by looking at it from the end point, it will legalize a god. It will not be a descent or a spiritualizing of the political, but it will despiritualize the political, while it will make the heavens and God into a legal and very mundane, if I may use the word, a secular entity. The gods will be made into secular legal subjects. So, and this in a way is a reversal of it, while it would kind of, obviously the history wars and all of that we see will be which we all know about, which I can speak about. But in the end, what it did was that the breach in the pseudo-secular was again a kind of breach of the state. And now, and you also got, and here I think the work of Girilal Jain and V.S. Naipaul, you had these very preeminent people endorsing Advani's critique of secularism. And you also have major Indian editors like Ashok Malik, Kanchan Gupta, Chandan Mitra. This is not, or Swapan Das Gupta, it's not without intellectual leadership. And like literally the final point, and this double speak is very reminiscent of the way in which Modi uses the word of the work of decolonization in India today to actually cause a breach and a reappraisal of the past. But of course, Advani's Rath Yatra intervened and reshaped the dense mediascape of late 20th century India, of which effects we are still seeing. But what is the key structural similarity is that it would also cause a breach between popular sovereignty, a new popular sovereignty, and government or the state. And so this very important gap between sovereignty and government, and or between, you could say the work of the law and the political, is where actually the true fight of Hindutva today is. It is to really close the gap between the state. And this is why it is instructive that the leader who is most likely to become the successor to Modi is a full-on ascetic coming from one of the most militant sects of Hinduism, i.e. Yogi Adityanath. So that will in a way complete this gap in which Gandhi had very productively opened up, sought, spiritualized, created, and which Advani also used, deployed, and animated anew for Hindu nationalism to become, or Hindutva to become, a so-called democratic force. But the contest now will be that it's also instructive that it was a yatra by Rahul Gandhi itself, which opened the first opening, created the first opening against Modi. And I'm not predicting if it's good or bad, but it also opens the question whether progressive populism is an oxymoron or something which will have its own day. And only, I think, that way, I think Indian democracy will be the touchstone of the future of, as it were, populist democracy that we are seeing worldwide. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shruti. I think you can maybe, take back this the presentation so we are all on the same screen.
Yes. How do I do this? I just have to go stop sharing screen, right?
Yeah, stop sharing, yeah.
Hang on, I have to I can't find it.
This is a time for questions, so you're welcome to raise your hand or post it in the chat. I think I saw a hand somewhere, or was it just a clap?
Sorry, I spoke quite fast.
No, that's fine. I think you can stop sharing, maybe.
I'm trying to go up there. Yes, stop now. New share, or should I go pause share?
Stop sharing.
Stop share. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Well, I think I could get started by asking a question which I always wanted to ask in the context of how you understand the idea of the political, which is, so someone like Aditya Nigam in his book, Decolonizing Theory and Thinking Across Traditions, when he thinks about the conception of the political, he actually also looks at the political elements in the Indian society. So for instance, as a historian of the Indian princely states, I really do see, for instance, Indian princely states as political elements in the Indian society. So when you have in your conception, when you move away from the state into the subject oriented understanding of the political, where do explicitly and historically political elements like the Indian princely states would fall? And that's, in that conception. And that's one question. And the second question that I wanted to ask is basically, it seems like the presentation that you just gave us about Gandhi's walk and the Rath Yatra, it seems like it is as much about the leaders as about the followers as well. So in some ways, like, is there a kind of understanding of the followers, people who walk with Gandhi or people who walk with Advani as a part of this work that you're doing? Or is it just like, one way to look at it is that you're just interested in the event, that the Rath Yatra or the walk itself? Or is it like is it something more? I'm just going back to that question.
I got it.
Who is the subject? Is it the leader of these movements, or these followers also have their subject? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I like that. I'm glad I get asked the princely India question, and it's a sovereignty question. And for me, I think what is interesting is that I did write a chapter on, as it were, the founding of the Republic in the Civil War. And I was fascinated because I was hoping to find arguments for monarchism in the 40s. And, and what is interesting is that given that debates around popular sovereignty, Hobbes, and so on, are about tyranny, are about monarchy, and where popular sovereignty might lie, you do not get that same kind of discussion in India, which is not to say that the princely stuff doesn't matter. But in terms of it's kind of the emergence of popular sovereignty, I see the princely states as more as, I would say order rather than the states themselves, as it were obstacles that had to be incorporated. And that way, I think Patel, this is why I spent time on Patel, he manages to kind of make that argument and succeed. So I'm a consequentialist. I like to see the winning arguments. So this is not repressed histories alone in that sense, But if you were to write a history of, as it were, the people who do not win out, then you would have to look at why the princes don't win out. And that's we should have a discussion on that. It is worth discussing. But they are able to for some time, in Madhura Sindhya is the last one, Jyotiraditya is the last one left to use the language, explicit language of Maharaj. And yesterday you've had like many Congress leaders dissing him for asking people to call him that. Anyway, that's a princely India story. And for me, the popular sovereignty question. So the thing about, let me just very quickly say, the event is not simply the meta events that we understand them, but philosophically, as I meant, like that they actually change the conditions of politics thereafter. And that's really what I mean by the event, which is a rupture, which means that you will have to historicize it. You will need to explain it. It will require some, as it were, both justification, but also historicization later. But there is no going back. There is no folding back of there's no seamless kind of going back to, in that sense, there's a kind of irreversibility to it, which is why I will not sort of see many events between, say, 31, 47, and 90. I see that there is, the elections, but elections are not events in that big way in which kind of the rules and norms change, which is to say that events therefore produce new truth effects on new truths itself. And this is what Advani has done, which is why media, pseudo-secularism, all this is incredibly important. But on your question of, and here again, I have to play my cards very crassly, which is not to say I'm So in terms of political thought, I would say that I am slightly more with people like Moyen, in the sense that I am interested in where, as it were, the normative acquires its power and normative capacity. So, which is not to say that I'm anti-subaltern. It is not about leaders and followers. It's about really what becomes normative. And here, obviously, this is the kind of associative moment. And to me, yes, Indian leadership is absolutely dying for a new theorization. I mean, and I will be doing a lot of that in my work, and therefore I'm not really looking at the story of leaders and masses as just followers, but really political leadership, but also the nature of Indian political elite has been transformative. You do not see, you can't compare someone like Modi with Rajiv Gandhi. If you look at the two massive popular mandates of the last 30 years, these two people socially belong to very different origins. So I'm interested in, you could say, political elite and political leadership. So I hope that answers it. And the question of the social, very quickly, the question of the social finds its greatest articulation in India, as you know, and I point out in the book, on the caste question, which of course is a very central, will have to be centrally dealt with in the book. Yeah. So social is not simply people coming, which is the kind of Gramscian communitarian way of looking. That's what I'm eschewing.
Yeah, there are two more questions in the chat. So I'm going to call upon Sayak Das Gupta to unmute and ask the question.
Sorry.
Hello, hi. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry I cannot really turn on my camera, but I'll just ask the question. Thank you for your lecture, Professor Kapila. So you introduced an interesting comparison between Satyagraha and Rath Yatra of Gandhi and Advani. While there was this mass following in Satyagraha and the resistance by the state against these public movements in pre-independent India, we see this reversal of role in some sense when we look at the Advani-led movement, where there was a considerable amount of people in the country who rejected and disallowed Advani's Yatra. For example, in West Bengal, the entrance of the Rath was, say, resisted by the people of Bengal. How do these two incidents about public participation in political movement and state interaction, in comparison, of course, with each other, frame our idea about, say, democracy in India and politics of participation in when we look at both the movements?
Okay, thank you. So my answer is very simple. What I mean is that the new political is founded, Hindutva included, as a kind of new political truth through, as it were, the breaking of the law. And it lies beyond the state. Of course, he's arrested, and of course, he's unable to go to many states. I mean, Bihar is obviously the key story here. But also there had been kind of protests in Uttar Pradesh, which we forget today. That actually, if there was mass mobilization against the Yatra in Uttar Pradesh. So that actually returns to the question of what would happen to the caste story in this period, because that is also the emergence of a new kind of coalition, Indian sort of coalition of caste politics, which is why we all know that the Mandal and the Mandir question are twinned in Indian politics. You can't disentangle them. So I think I would just leave it there. I do not see this as simple resistance or dissent, but I see this as a different kind of I mean, what I'm trying to argue is that Hindu nationalism has to produce its own popular sovereignty. And which is what it is doing. It is creating its own popular and a new collective. This is not simply asking, so it's not the same political subject. It will ask either for a transformation of the same person, or it will absolutely create a new political subject through such an act. That's what my thing is. This is not, so yes, though there are people who would resist it, there are people who would also then mobilize through the Mandal movement. And you are seeing that even in today's politics, there's a desire to there's almost a repetition compulsion to kind of repeat the same Mandal coalition against Modi. The jury's out whether actually you can play the new playbook with so in my view, I've written that in the last column, that actually Mandal 2 is one step behind Hindutva 3. So if there are 3 iterations of Hindutva that have gone in, Mandal politics is only now beginning to have a second iteration of its politics. So we will see where this goes. And here it's complicated by the Dalit question and Dalit mobilization and support to Hindu nationalism, but also the kind of, I would say, not saturation, but certainly a limit point with OBC parties that is very clearly in the mix in India. And once you have, as it were, these parties not being able to have successful leaderships, successor leaderships, I'm not sure what the future of these parties will be, and whether it is SP or whether it is BRS even, or which are essentially OBC parties. Yeah.
And next in line is Mayank.
Hello, hi Professor. Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question similar to what you spoke about towards the end about the Mandal Commission. So I loved your point regarding shaping new truths through yatras in Gandhi's case and Advani's case, and maybe through Rahul Gandhi as well now. In that light, to what extent do you think Advani's Rath Yatra was motivated by not a continuation of Meerut and Shah Bano, but by an urgent need to reshape post-Mandal implementation in 1990? Because in that, I see that it's more of a sinister or even desperate attempt to reshape the dominant narrative in 1990 when VP Singh implements post-Mandal.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. It's a historian's question. Where do you see the continuity and where do you see the break? My point in mentioning the Meerut riots and so on was to say that this was long in the making. The idea of the Rath Yatra was not like Gandhi's idea of salt satyagraha, which actually was Gandhi walked every day. He walked 18 kilometers every day. But that idea came to him quite late, particularly over a debate around actually economic statistics, which triggered it. I wanted to say that this is not to kind of give it a seamless continuity, but that those moments were not chosen. But the moment that was chosen was indeed of Mandal, but also of coalition politics, right? So, what is the kind of political valence of kind of caste? That's a whole other paper. That will require me to kind of put my chapter on Ambedkar in dialogue with something like Kanshiram and BSP, which I will be doing in the book. So yeah, I mean, a great point. I mean, of course, the trigger, I take it for given that the trigger is the expansion of affirmative action in India and the Mandal Commission.
I'm going to read out a question from Kanika, and she asks, in the productive distinction between subject, agent, and mobilization, is there an implied tension between the people and the crowd/mob with usual majoritarian connotations? Which emerges as the proper subject in your subject-oriented account of the Indian political?
Fabulous question. Absolutely fabulous question, because I do look at the question of the semi-sovereignty of the crowd in my chapter on partition violence, that actually this is a moment of discovery of popular sovereignty, but it also therefore produces a kind of guilt-free or an agentless violence where you cannot, you cannot find the individual perpetrators precisely because the crowd acquires the work of semi-sovereignty and anonymity, which allows killing with impunity and produces. So for me, of course, partition violence is therefore deeply political. It's not simply the letting out of emotions. So I would I'm not so sure about the mob, but I definitely see a kind of overlapping between the people crowd, and the third category I would use is the electoral majority. So that there is a kind of overlapping, and this is where, going back to an earlier question about are they resistant subjects, the answer is actually new majorities in the Rosenwaldon sense are being created through these events. So it's not simply that the Hindu majority is one and therefore that needs to be kind of unified. That's how people tend to think about it. It's quite the opposite, that a new idea of a new majority is being instituted through these truth effects. So yes, people crowd electoral majority.
Well, is there anyone else with questions? We are almost time, but there is probably time for one more question if anyone has. Okay. So, okay, we have a question. So
Yes.
this is Gurmat Singh Brar asking,
Yes.
okay. I want to ask Professor Kapila regarding the history of collective action in Indian history. For example, recently in Lisa Mitchell's book on Indian
Yes.
democracy, she presents the history of non-violent protest as being a pre-political phenomenon which goes back to Mughal India. For instance, the famous Banaras protest against house tax in 1811 by the Brahmins. So in what ways do you think Gandhi reconceptualized or engaged with this older notion of popular mobilization through his notion of satyagraha?
Okay, thank you. I have read the book, and I'm sorry Lisa had to go to AAA so she can't join us. She wrote to me. I would have enjoyed her thing. So yes, I mean, I think I'm slightly different. My emphasis is slightly different in the sense that hers is much more, I would say, a subaltern reconstruction of everyday and acts of resistance, which are all important for Indian democracy. As I said, I'm trying to kind of write the history of new political norms. So slightly very different focus, even though. So in terms of, for me, as I said, to me, the closest Gandhi comes in his thinking on satyagraha is the work on pilgrimage and yatra itself, and rather than actually older things. He also had read Thoreau, and he recommends, everyone to read Thoreau on walking. I mean, this is, he's trying to use, it's not like he's, so for him, I think these are actually, as I've argued elsewhere, but others have also argued, Gandhi is not really historically minded. He doesn't, he's A, himself an anti-historicist, and B, I think he, if I can be provocative, it was a bit like Nietzsche in the sense that he's unsure whether history has anything to teach us. He is interested in some eternal truths, if I can put it like that, which tend to come from, as it were, his take on certain theological, religious traditions. So which is why I spent some time describing the work of Tirth and Yatra and walking in sort of, the Indic world. So yeah, that's what I would say, which is to say that, I can't go too much deeper back precisely because the history of the Indian state is a very recent history. So the genealogies of so in that sense, to me, the history of Indian democracy cannot really be traced earlier than the 1920s and 30s. So that's where I leave it, and which is why I would also not see the history of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva earlier than Savarkar's writing of Hindutva in 1923. So I would not like to historicize them any deeper than that.
Well, I think that brings to a close this really exciting seminar. And thank you, Shruti, for coming and talking to us. I know it's already evening in London. So please join me in thanking her.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.